The Cry in the Dark. Dr. Michael Anderson had been a pediatrician for over a decade, but he had never experienced anything quite like the events that unfolded one fateful evening. The weight of his 12-hour shift at Willow Creek General Hospital felt particularly heavy that night. The sterile hospital there had drained him of his energy, and all he wanted was to retreat to the solitude of his small apartment, pour himself a drink, and unwind. He had witnessed the usual chaos: crying children, worried parents, the tragic accidents, and the routine life and death decisions. But as he exited the hospital, the usual humdrum of his night shift was different. The night was cool, crisp, one of those rare moments when the air had a subtle bite to it, enough to remind him that the season was shifting. As he walked toward his car, Michael's exhausted mind began to drift, replaying the day's events, the faces of his patients, and the uncertainty that seemed to hang over so many of their lives. It had been a difficult shift. There was always something in the air after an emergency room case, a feeling that lingered long after you left. His mind was elsewhere when a faint sound broke through his thoughts. It wasn't the typical sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic or the low murmur of people. This was different. Soft but distinct, a cry. His eyes darted toward the entrance of the hospital. The emergency entrance was quiet, abandoned by both staff and patients. The cry came again, desperate, high-pitched, and laced with fear. The hairs on Michael's neck stood up. He was no stranger to the sound of babies crying, of course. It was a daily occurrence at the hospital, but this cry felt different. It felt wrong. Something in his gut told him it wasn't a cry for attention. It was a cry for help. Without thinking, Michael walked toward the noise, his shoes clicking softly against the pavement. As he approached the corner by the emergency room, he stopped short. There, huddled in the shadows, was a small bundle, so small, wrapped in a tattered blanket, discarded carelessly in the corner as if it were nothing more than refuse. Michael's breath caught in his chest, his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and there, lying in the cold night air, was an infant, barely a few months old, its small body shivering under the thin fabric that had been wrapped around it. The child's face was scrunched in distress, its tiny mouth open in a heartbreaking wail. His heart dropped to his stomach as his gaze swept the area. No one was around. No parents, no guardian, not even a person who had noticed. Just the cold, dark night and this vulnerable child. Michael's pulse quickened, his trained medical mind already calculating the possibilities. Whoever had left this baby here had done so without a second thought, without a shred of humanity. He rushed to the child's side, crouching down slowly to avoid startling it. His hand shook slightly as he gently lifted the baby from the cold concrete. The child's cries softened almost immediately as he cradled it against his chest. Michael's chest tightened, and his thoughts flashed to the thousands of abandoned children he had read about in medical journals, the stories of neglect and cruelty that filled the pages of statistics and case files. But none of those stories had ever felt this real. The baby's skin was a rich, dark brown, smooth, tender. The dark, curly hair peeked out from beneath the blanket, and as the child's tiny eyes locked with Michael's, an overwhelming sense of connection flooded him. It was an unspoken bond, an inexplicable understanding between them. The baby's eyes, large and dark, stared up at him with such intensity, as if it recognized Michael as its last hope. Michael's heart swelled. There was something in those eyes, something that asked for help, something that begged for love, something that Michael couldn't ignore. "Shay," he whispered, holding the baby gently against him, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. "It's okay. You're safe now." His fingers brushed against the soft skin of the baby's head as he took a moment to compose himself. It was hard for him to grasp, but at that moment, there was only one thing that mattered. The child needed him. He took a deep breath and glanced around again, his eyes scanning the empty street and the parking lot. Where had the baby come from? Why was it abandoned here? The questions pounded in his head, but he couldn't answer them now. There was no one around to ask. The urgency of the situation, the baby's condition, was all that mattered. Gently, Michael stood up, adjusting the child in his arms as he turned toward the entrance of the hospital. The baby was still so small, too small to have been left alone in the world. There had to be a story behind this. There always was. But Michael pushed that thought away for the moment. Right now, the only thing that mattered was this little life in his arms. The baby's tiny form, so fragile, so helpless, seemed to fit so perfectly against Michael's chest. He could feel the warmth of the child's small body against him, a stark contrast to the cold night around them. The baby's cries had quieted down, replaced by soft, contented sniffs as it nestled against him, trusting him without question. As Michael walked through the hospital doors, the security guard at the entrance raised an eyebrow. "Dr. Anderson?" he asked, his tone a mix of confusion and curiosity. Michael nodded, offering a half-smile, though his heart was still racing. "I found him outside," he said, his voice more steady than he felt. "I think he's been abandoned. We need to get him checked out." The guard nodded quickly, pressing a button to let Michael through the entrance. Michael took the elevator up to the pediatric ward, the baby still cradled in his arms, his thoughts racing. Who would do this? Who would leave a child so alone, so vulnerable? When he reached the pediatric ward, the nurse on duty greeted him with concern as soon as she saw the baby. Her eyes widened at the sight of the tiny child, and she immediately took action, guiding Michael into an examination room. "Let's get him looked at right away," she said. As they worked, Michael couldn't help but feel a strong sense of responsibility welling up inside him. The sterile smell of the pediatric ward, the beeping machines, the frantic pace, it all faded away as he focused on the baby. The child, his small face still scrunched in confusion and fear, seemed to sense his calm presence, gradually settling into Michael's arms. There were tests, scans, and a round of paperwork that Michael had to complete. But all the while, one thought echoed in his mind. How could someone do this? How could someone leave this baby all alone in the dark? After a thorough examination, the medical team assured Michael that the child was healthy, physically, at least. He was malnourished, but he would recover with care. Mentally, however, Michael couldn't be sure. Trauma at such a young age could leave lasting scars, and he would have to be patient as the child adjusted to a new life, one that was filled with uncertainty. As Michael sat with the baby in his arms, something deep inside him shifted. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another patient. This was a child who needed love, security, and care, and Michael was the only one there to provide it. The thought of letting this child slip through the cracks, of leaving him in the system, didn't sit right with Michael. The connection he had felt earlier, that inexplicable bond between them, could not be ignored. In that moment, Michael made a choice, one that would change his life forever. "This baby is mine," he whispered to himself. "He's mine now." A new beginning. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, hospital visits, and sleepless nights. After Michael made the decision to adopt Jason, his life had been thrown into a whirlwind. The first step was getting all the legal work in order. There was a sense of urgency to it. Something deep inside told him that the connection he felt with Jason was not just a fleeting moment of compassion. He had never believed in fate, but this felt like destiny. Jason was meant to be his child, and he was meant to be his father. Despite the whirlwind of emotions that flooded him, Michael never doubted his decision for a second. Jason needed a home, a future, a family, and Michael, despite the doubts and criticisms from the outside world, was the one who would provide that. His decision was made, and there was no turning back now. The first few months of their life together were a delicate balancing act. Michael, though a skilled pediatrician, was still learning what it meant to be a father. There were nights when Jason cried in his sleep, thrashing around as if trapped in some nightmare of abandonment that Michael couldn't fully understand. There were mornings when Jason refused to leave the safety of his arms, afraid of the world beyond the small warm cocoon Michael had created for him. Michael was patient. He had to be. He knew that healing wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Jason had been through something that no child should ever have to experience. He had been left alone in the world, abandoned by the very people who were meant to love and protect him. He had no memory of those first few hours or days of his life, but the trauma lingered in his small, fragile heart. It took time before Jason began to trust Michael, before he stopped flinching at the sound of a raised voice or the feel of a hand near his face. Michael had to learn to be there for Jason, not just as a doctor, but as a father. There were moments when he had to put his own emotions aside, when the weight of the world felt like it was pressing down on him, and just hold Jason through the storm. Slowly, very slowly, things began to change. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. But it wasn't without its hurdles. Jason's first steps into the world outside the protective walls of Michael's apartment were tentative. He would peek out from behind Michael's legs, eyes wide with uncertainty, watching the other children at the park, afraid to join them. Michael would crouch down to his level, holding out his hand with a gentle smile. "It's okay, Jason. You don't have to be afraid. You're safe now." Over time, Jason began to trust him more and more. The first time Jason ventured out of the shadows of the park and joined the other children, Michael's heart swelled with pride. He had been there for every step of the way, guiding him through the unknown. The small victories, like Jason's first solo bike ride or the first time he spoke to another child at school, became the markers of their progress. It was these little milestones, these quiet moments, that meant everything to Michael. But despite Jason's growing sense of security, Michael couldn't ignore the subtle undercurrents of doubt that lingered in the air. The whispers never fully stopped. People in town, his colleagues at the hospital, neighbors, even distant relatives, never quite seemed to understand. The first time Michael attended a social gathering with Jason, he noticed the sideways glances, the judgment masked behind forced smiles. He was used to it by now, the uncomfortable silence that followed them wherever they went. He tried not to let it bother him, but it was impossible to ignore. At first, he had hoped that time would ease the tension. Surely, people would come to see that Jason wasn't just a charity case, a child to be pitied. He was smart, kind, and full of life. But to some, it seemed that the mere fact that Michael, a white man, had adopted a black child was something to be scrutinized. They couldn't see beyond the surface, the superficial difference of their skin. At work, things were no different. Michael's colleagues, once respectful of his expertise, now seemed to view him through a lens tainted with skepticism. "You're going to take on a kid, Michael. A black child, no less," one of his colleagues had asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's going to be a lot harder than you think, you know." Michael had been taken aback. He had expected some resistance, but he hadn't expected it to be so blatant, so rooted in ignorance. He had spent years building his career, earning the respect of his peers, and now, here he was, dealing with something far more personal. He wasn't just being questioned as a doctor. He was being questioned as a father, as a man who had the audacity to change his life for the sake of a child who had no one else. But despite the harsh words, despite the whispers and the sideways glances, Michael never once wavered in his commitment to Jason. He knew what he had signed up for. This was his son. This was the child he would raise, love, and protect. Nothing else mattered. And then there were the moments that made it all worth it. The nights when Jason curled up beside him. The two of them watching a movie or reading a book, and Michael could feel the bond between them growing stronger. It was these quiet moments that reminded him of why he had made this choice. Jason wasn't just an orphan he had taken in. Jason was his son, and Michael was his father. As Jason grew, so did their relationship. Michael saw glimpses of the man he would one day become, strong, compassionate, resilient. It wasn't easy. There were still struggles, still moments of doubt, still days when it felt like the world was pressing against them. trying to force them to fit into molds that didn't belong. But Michael stood firm. They were a family, and nothing could take that away from them. As Jason entered school, Michael watched with pride as his son excelled. Jason was intelligent, curious, and hardworking. He made friends easily, and though there were moments when the world tried to define him by his skin color, Jason always managed to rise above it. Michael made sure of it. He taught Jason the value of resilience, the importance of standing tall in the face of adversity. He taught him that family was not bound by blood. It was bound by love, by sacrifice, and by the unwavering commitment to one another. But even as Jason flourished, the whispers outside their world never ceased. Michael tried to shield his son from them, but it was impossible to keep them from seeping in. There were always those who questioned their bond, who doubted Michael's intentions, who made assumptions about what their relationship meant. It was a harsh reality that Michael had to accept. Some people would never understand. Yet, he remained undeterred. With every step Jason took, every achievement he reached, Michael's heart swelled with pride. He had given this child a chance at life. He had given him a future. And in return, Jason had given him a purpose, a reason to keep going, to keep fighting against the narrow-mindedness of the world. Jason was thriving, and Michael was the one who had made it happen. As they walked through life together, side by side, Michael knew that their story was one of resilience. It was a story of love overcoming prejudice, of father and son facing the world together, no matter what challenges came their way. And in those quiet moments, when Jason would turn to him and smile, Michael couldn't help but think that, against all odds, this was exactly where he was meant to be. The test of character. As Jason continued to grow, so did the complexities of their relationship and the challenges Michael faced in raising him. The once quiet whispers had started to evolve into something louder, something more blatant. In their small town, people were quick to judge, and their curiosity about Michael's decision to adopt a black child grew with each passing day. What had once been casual whispers behind closed doors had now found their way into the open. Comments were made in hushed voices at the grocery store or in the waiting rooms of medical offices, where Michael once earned respect as a pediatrician, but now found himself subject to unwanted scrutiny. The town wasn't malicious, but its cultural ignorance and small-town values had a way of suffocating the people who didn't quite fit into their mold. Michael was now the man who had dared to adopt a black child. The more time passed, the more the skepticism grew, not just from his colleagues, but from the community as a whole. People began to question his motives. They saw him not as a doctor, a man with a kind heart, but as a spectacle. And this, in turn, created cracks in the foundation of his confidence. The first time Jason noticed the looks, it was after a school event. Michael had picked him up from a school play, the lights from the stage still reflecting in Jason's eyes as they walked hand in hand through the school's parking lot. Jason, now 7, had been holding onto his father's hand with a confidence that made Michael proud. But that confidence faltered the moment he looked up and saw the group of parents standing near the entrance of the school. They were whispering among themselves, their eyes shifting between Jason and Michael with an expression that was a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "Why are they looking at us like that?" Jason asked, his voice quiet, laced with confusion and hurt. Michael looked down at his son, his heart aching. Jason had always been perceptive, and he was beginning to understand what the world thought of him, of them. Michael could feel the lump in his throat as he crouched down to Jason's level. "Don't worry about them, Jason," he said, his voice firm but filled with compassion. "People have a hard time understanding things they haven't experienced. But you're not alone. You're my son, and no one can take that away from us. We don't need to explain ourselves." Jason nodded but didn't speak. He held onto his father's hand even tighter as they walked to the car. Michael could feel his son's discomfort, but he couldn't help but wonder, how many more times would this happen? How many more times would Jason be subjected to the judgment of a world that was not ready to embrace the difference in their family? Later that night, As they sat down for dinner in the cozy warmth of their home, Michael couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. Jason had retreated into silence, his fork absent-mindedly pushing food around his plate. He had seen the way the other children stared at him, heard the way the adults talked behind his back, and it had clearly left an impact on his small heart. "Dad," Jason finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "Am I different?" The question hung in the air, heavy with a depth that only a child could express in such a simple, honest way. Michael paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, unsure of how to respond. How could he explain the harsh reality of the world to a child so young? How could he shield him from a prejudice he had never experienced himself? "You're not different to me, Jason," Michael said, his voice filled with warmth and conviction. "You're my son. That's all that matters. Your skin color doesn't change that. You're special, and you're loved exactly as you are." But even as he spoke those words, a part of Michael felt a deep sense of helplessness. The world wasn't ready to see Jason for who he truly was. And despite all the love and protection Michael could offer, Jason would eventually have to face the harshness of the world on his own. In the days that followed, Michael made it his mission to find ways to help Jason navigate these growing feelings of alienation. He signed him up for a local community art class, hoping that it would give Jason a sense of belonging, a way to express himself. But even in that environment, Michael could sense the underlying tension. The other children were kind, but there was always a subtle distance, as if they didn't know how to approach Jason, as if they were unsure of what to make of his presence. One afternoon, as Michael was picking Jason up from the art class, a mother approached him. She was a well-known figure in the community, an active member of the PTA, and had always maintained a polite but distant demeanor toward Michael. This time, however, she didn't seem as cordial. Her tone was cautious, almost hesitant. "I just wanted to say that Jason is such a bright boy," she began, her words clipped. "But sometimes I wonder if he's getting the right kind of support. I mean, it must be hard for him, with the way things are these days." Michael felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the way his blood began to boil whenever someone hinted at the fact that Jason wasn't normal, that there was something wrong with their family. He took a deep breath and turned to face the woman, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm sure Jason is getting all the support he needs," Michael replied, his voice firm. "He's thriving and he's loved. But maybe it's the world that needs to change, not him." The woman seemed taken aback by his response, her mouth opening and closing, as if she had more to say but couldn't quite find the words. Michael didn't wait for her to say anything more. He simply turned and walked away, his hand firmly gripping Jason's, his mind racing. When they reached the car, Jason was quiet again, his eyes downcast. Michael knew that the comment had affected him, but he didn't know how to comfort him. The burden of being judged, of being seen as different, was a weight Jason would have to carry for the rest of his life. Michael couldn't shield him from everything, no matter how hard he tried. In the following weeks, Michael found himself spending more time with Jason, teaching him how to hold his head high in the face of prejudice. They would walk through the town together, Michael offering words of encouragement whenever he saw a familiar face in the crowd. But there were days when even his words couldn't mask the pain that Jason carried. There were moments when Jason would ask why people treated him differently, why they stared, why they whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. The world outside was growing colder, more divided, and Michael had no answers for his son. He could only teach him to be strong, to keep moving forward despite the obstacles in his path. One evening, after another long day of stares and whispers, Michael and Jason sat together in the backyard. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the sky. They sat in silence, watching the colors change. Jason's head rested on Michael's shoulder, and for a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. "You know, Dad," Jason finally said, his voice steady, "I don't care what they say. I know who I am. I know who you are. And that's enough for me." Michael's heart swelled with pride. Jason's resilience was stronger than any prejudice he could face, and Michael knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, Jason would always have the strength to walk it with his head held high. It was moments like this, when Jason spoke with such conviction, that Michael realized just how far they had come. They had faced the harshness of the world together, and they had come out stronger. The world might judge them, might question them, but their bond was unbreakable. They were a family, and no one could take that away. A trial of strength and integrity. As the years passed, Jason continued to mature into a young man of remarkable intelligence, compassion, and resilience. His bond with Michael had only strengthened, becoming unshakable in the face of the prejudice they encountered. But despite the love and support they shared at home, Jason couldn't escape the fact that the world outside wasn't always kind to him. And for Michael, it was becoming increasingly difficult to protect his son from the harsh realities of society. Every day, Jason faced an invisible battle, one that wasn't just about skin color, but about how people perceived him and the family they had created. It was during his high school years that the world began to challenge Jason in ways he hadn't experienced before. Jason, once the quiet observer, had grown into a confident young man who excelled academically and athletically. He was respected by many, admired by his peers, and often considered a role model. But even in the midst of his achievements, there was always that undercurrent of tension, that invisible line drawn between him and the others, a line defined by assumptions and biases that Michael had hoped Jason would never fully encounter. One particular instance stood out more than any other. Jason was invited to a prestigious academic award ceremony, an event that brought together the brightest students in the school. It was a night of celebration, where the community came together to honor the achievements of the youth who had set themselves apart. Michael, as always, was proud. He had raised a son who was determined, intelligent, and kind-hearted, someone who could have achieved anything he set his mind to. This night, however, would test them both in ways they weren't prepared for. As they arrived at the event, Michael could sense the excitement in the air. Jason looked dapper in a dark suit, his face bright with anticipation. It was a special night for him, one he had worked tirelessly toward, and Michael couldn't have been prouder. They entered the hall, and as they made their way to their seats, Michael noticed a group of parents chatting in the corner. He could hear snippets of their conversation, laughter, friendly banter, but one comment caught his attention. "Did you hear about that Anderson boy? The one with the doctor for a father. I heard they're giving him an award tonight. But you know, he's just so different, don't you think?" Michael's heart sank. The judgment was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on Jason, who was happily chatting with some of the other students. But it was hard not to feel the weight of their words, the implications of what they meant. Before long, the ceremony began, and Jason's name was announced. He stood up, his heart pounding, a look of disbelief on his face as he made his way to the stage. Michael watched from the audience, his chest swelling with pride. He knew how hard Jason had worked for this moment. He had earned it, every bit of it. But as Jason approached the podium to accept his award, the whispers from the crowd grew louder. A few chuckles broke through, followed by sidelong glances that couldn't be hidden. Jason paused for a moment, the sound of those whispers cutting through him like a knife. But then, he did something that surprised everyone, including Michael. He smiled, not the forced, polite smile of someone trying to fit in, but a real smile, a smile that radiated confidence and strength. He walked up to the podium, took the microphone, and looked out at the crowd. "Thank you," Jason said, his voice steady, despite the tension in the room. "I've worked hard to get here, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished. But let me tell you something. It doesn't matter where I came from, what I look like, or who my father is. What matters is who I choose to be, and that's who I want you all to remember." The room fell silent. Michael's breath caught in his throat, his eyes fixed on Jason. In that moment, his son wasn't just accepting an award. He was standing up for himself, for the truth of his existence, for the family they had built together. And in that moment, Michael knew that Jason had become something more than just a product of his upbringing. He had become his own person, someone who wouldn't let the world dictate his worth. But the evening wasn't over. As Jason returned to his seat, there was still a sense of unease in the air. The murmurs continued, though more subdued, and Michael could see the way the other students looked at Jason, some with respect, others with uncertainty. They didn't fully understand him, not yet, and perhaps they never would. When the ceremony ended, Michael and Jason made their way toward the exit, their hearts heavy but their spirits lifted. Michael could tell that the night had been difficult for Jason, even though he had handled himself with grace. The judgment had stung, but Jason had risen above it. That was the key. Jason had learned to not let others define him. He was his own person, and that was a power that no one could take away. As they walked to the car, Michael put his hand on Jason's shoulder. "You were amazing tonight," he said softly. "You stood up for yourself, and that's the most important thing." Jason smiled, his eyes still gleaming with pride. "Thanks, Dad. It wasn't easy, but I think I finally get it. I can't change the way they see me, but I can change the way I see myself." The drive home was quiet but comfortable. Jason seemed lost in thought, his gaze staring out of the window, while Michael reflected on everything that had transpired. They had faced prejudice together, time and time again, but tonight had been different. Jason had truly embraced who he was, who they both were, and that made all the difference. The next day, at school, things took an unexpected turn. A group of students who had previously kept their distance approached Jason during lunch. They were a group of the school's top athletes, popular and well-liked, and Jason had always kept to himself when it came to socializing with them. But today, they were different. They weren't there to mock him or judge him. Instead, they were there to apologize. "Hey, Jason," one of them, a boy named Kyle, began, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "Look, we didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable last night. We were wrong. Man, you've earned everything. That speech you gave, it hit us. You deserve that award, and we respect you." Jason blinked in surprise, unsure of how to respond. For years, he had been on the receiving end of their teasing, their sideways glances, and their dismissive behavior. But now, they were offering something different, something more valuable than respect. They were offering an understanding, an acknowledgement that they had been wrong. "Thanks," Jason said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying his emotions. "It means a lot to hear that." In that moment, Michael realized something. The world had always been harsh, but it was also capable of change. People could grow, could learn, could recognize their mistakes. And Jason, his son, was teaching them how to do just that. It wasn't a perfect world. Far from it. But as Michael watched Jason stand tall in the face of adversity, he knew that the love they shared, the strength they drew from one another, was powerful enough to withstand anything. A legacy of change. The years rolled on, and Jason's journey into adulthood was a testament to the strength Michael had always known he possessed. Yet as Jason neared the end of his high school years and prepared for college, the realities of adulthood began to loom larger on the horizon. The struggle to be seen for who he truly was, to navigate a world that still wasn't ready to fully accept his uniqueness, continued to test both father and son. As Jason prepared to leave for university, Michael felt a bittersweet sense of pride mixed with worry. This next phase of life would introduce Jason to a new set of challenges. Challenges that Michael knew would require all of his son's resilience and grace. But this time, Michael also knew that Jason would face these challenges differently. He had grown in ways that Michael never could have imagined when he first held him as a baby. Jason was no longer the boy struggling to understand his place in the world. He was a young man on the cusp of greatness, with a deep sense of purpose and identity. The day before Jason's departure, Michael sat with him on the porch, the evening air cool and comforting. They had spent the day packing, sorting through the last few items Jason would need for his new life. Michael had been quiet, knowing that this moment, this goodbye, would be one of the most significant in their journey together. "You ready for this?" Michael asked, his voice softer than usual, carrying the weight of a father's love and concern. Jason turned to him, his eyes steady and filled with determination. "I think so. I mean, I'm excited. But, yeah, I'm nervous too. This is a big change." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "It's normal to be nervous. Change is always hard, especially when you're going into something new. But I know you'll handle it. You've handled so much already, Jason. I've seen you grow into someone who can take on anything. You're ready for this." Jason's gaze softened as he met his father's eyes, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. "Thanks, Dad. I wouldn't have made it this far without you." The words were simple, but they carried the profound truth that had defined their relationship for so many years. Jason was ready for the world, ready to step into a new chapter of his life, one where he would encounter new people, new ideas, and new obstacles. But above all, he was ready to face those challenges as the person he had become, a person shaped by love, resilience, and the strength of his father's unwavering support. The next morning, as they loaded Jason's bags into the car and prepared for the long drive to his new university, Michael felt an unfamiliar sense of finality. This wasn't the first time Jason had left the house. He had gone on summer camps, spent weekends away with friends, but this time it felt different. This was the beginning of his independence, the beginning of a journey that Michael had always known would come, but never truly prepared for. As they drove toward the university, the weight of the moment settled over them. Michael looked over at Jason, who was quietly staring out of the window. He could see the excitement and the anxiety battling within his son, and it reminded him of the first time they had driven to the hospital together, when Jason had been just a baby, so fragile and innocent. "You know, Jason," Michael said, breaking the silence, "when I first met you, I never imagined we'd be here. I never imagined this day would come. But every step of the way, I've watched you grow into someone incredible. Someone who, no matter the obstacles, stands tall. And that's what makes me proud. Not the awards, not the accomplishments, but the person you've become." Jason's eyes met his father's, and in that brief moment, they shared a quiet understanding. The years of struggle, the moments of pain, and the triumphs they had celebrated together, all of it had led to this. Jason was no longer just the boy who had been adopted in the dark corner of the hospital parking lot. He was a man, ready to make his own way in the world. "I won't let you down, Dad," Jason said quietly, his voice firm with conviction. "I'm going to make a difference, just like you taught me." Michael could feel the lump in his throat again, but he forced a smile, blinking back the tears that threatened to surface. "You've already made a difference, Jason, and I'm proud of you every day for it." They arrived at the university, and Michael helped Jason move into his dorm room. It was a small space, but Jason seemed excited as he unpacked, making the room his own. There was an energy in the air, a new beginning for both of them. And for a moment, Michael allowed himself to feel the hope that had carried him through all these years. Jason had always been his son, but now he was becoming something greater. And that was a beautiful thing to witness. The first few weeks of Jason's time at college were filled with new experiences. He attended lectures, met new friends, and immersed himself in the world of higher learning. But even amidst the excitement of university life, there were moments when the weight of his identity crept in. He still faced prejudice, albeit in more subtle ways. Some of the looks and comments were less overt, but they were there, small, quiet reminders that the world hadn't fully changed. Not yet. One evening, after a particularly exhausting week, Jason called Michael. His voice was strained, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed unsure of himself. "Dad, I don't know if I'm cut out for this," Jason said, his words heavy with doubt. "I feel like I'm still fighting the same battles. People look at me differently, and it's like they can't see past, you know, who I am. They just see the color of my skin." Michael's heart ached for his son. He had hoped that this new chapter in Jason's life would be different, that college would offer him an escape from the constant scrutiny. But life wasn't that simple. Jason was still fighting the fight, still having to prove that he was worthy of respect and recognition, not because of his background, but because of who he was as a person. "I know it's tough, Jason," Michael said, his voice steady. "And I know it doesn't always feel fair, but you've already proven that you can rise above it. You've been doing it your whole life. You don't have to fight these battles alone. You've got me, and you've got yourself. And that's enough." Jason sighed, the weight in his voice lifting slightly. "Thanks, Dad. I needed to hear that." It wasn't a perfect solution. There was no magic way to make the prejudice disappear, but Michael knew that Jason would keep going. He would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for those who came after him. He would be a force of change, just as Michael had always hoped he would be. That evening, as they hung up the phone, Michael sat quietly in the living room, reflecting on everything that had led up to this moment. Jason was no longer just a young boy he had adopted. He was a young man with a purpose, a mission, and a heart full of strength. The world was still flawed, but Jason had become a symbol of hope, hope that change was possible, that love could overcome prejudice, and that, in the end, it was the strength of the human spirit that would win. The fight was far from over, but as Michael looked at the family photos on the wall, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. His son had grown into someone remarkable, and that, above all, was his greatest achievement. The true measure of family. Years passed swiftly, and the story of Jason Anderson evolved into something even greater than anyone could have imagined. Michael's once quiet and reserved son had transformed into a young man who not only excelled in his chosen field, but also began to make waves in the larger community. Jason's path wasn't without its challenges, but with every obstacle he faced, his resilience only grew stronger. The lessons his father had taught him, the importance of integrity, perseverance, and self-worth, were now woven into the fabric of Jason's very being. It was now Jason's senior year of college, and he had become one of the brightest students in the entire university. His reputation for both academic excellence and leadership skills was widely recognized. Yet, despite all his accomplishments, Jason felt something missing. His success, while fulfilling, lacked the personal connection and impact that he had always hoped for. He was on the brink of graduation, and with it, the promise of a new future, a future that would require more than just knowledge and talent. It would require compassion, understanding, and the willingness to make a real difference in the world. One afternoon, Jason received a call that would change his life. It was from an old friend, someone he hadn't heard from in years. Kyle, the boy from high school who had once mocked him, was now calling in a time of need. Jason felt an uneasy tightness in his chest as he answered the phone. "Hey, Jason. It's me, Kyle," the voice on the other end said, sounding strained and anxious. "I know we haven't talked much since high school, and I'm not sure where to begin, but I really need your help." Jason didn't say anything at first, unsure of what to expect. The Kyle he remembered had been part of the crowd that once made him feel like an outsider, but the tone in Kyle's voice now, desperation, regret, was enough to make Jason listen. "What's going on?" Jason asked cautiously. "I don't know if you remember, but my mom's been really sick. Cancer. And things have taken a turn for the worse. We've tried everything, but it's not looking good," Kyle said, his voice breaking. "I don't know who else to turn to, but I remember what you did, how you always helped people, even when they didn't deserve it. I need you, Jason." Jason took a deep breath. He thought about his father's lessons, the lessons of forgiveness, the importance of extending grace, and the power of healing. Kyle's past actions didn't erase the fact that, in this moment, he was reaching out for help. And perhaps this was the very opportunity Jason had been waiting for, to show the world that his heart was larger than the hurt others had caused him. "Of course, Kyle," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll do whatever I can to help." That evening, Jason called his father. It had been a while since they had spoken in such depth, but he felt the need to reach out. Michael answered the phone almost immediately, and Jason's words came pouring out. "Dad, I don't know what's happening, but Kyle called me. He needs my help. His mom's really sick. I'm not sure what I can do, but I think I need to go back home." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He had watched Jason grow into the young man he had become, one who, despite the hardships, still found it in himself to care for others. This was a moment of reckoning for Jason, a test of his true character. Michael knew that whatever path Jason chose, he would support him fully. "I'm proud of you, son," Michael said, his voice steady and filled with warmth. "This isn't about forgetting the past, Jason. It's about moving forward, showing the world the kind of person you've become. Helping Kyle is a chance to show him, and yourself, that compassion can heal even the deepest wounds. You've got this." The next few days were filled with a whirlwind of travel and emotions as Jason returned home to support Kyle and his family. He was no longer the young man who had struggled with self-doubt and insecurity. He had become someone whose presence could bring peace and comfort in the most trying times. But even with all the maturity and strength he had gained, there was something bittersweet about returning to the town that had once rejected him. When Jason arrived at Kyle's house, he was greeted with a mixture of apprehension and relief. Kyle's mother, a kind woman in her 50s, was bedridden, pale, and weak. The familiar scent of antiseptic hung in the air, and there was an undeniable heaviness that seemed to settle over the entire home. But there was also something else, something Jason had never expected to find: gratitude. Kyle's father, a man who had been absent from his life during much of high school, now stood by the doorway, his expression a mixture of regret and hope. "You're here," Kyle's father said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what to say, Jason. I've thought a lot about what we did to you, and I know I wasn't the man I should have been. We were wrong, all of us. But you're the only one who can help now. Please, please help my wife." Jason nodded, though he could feel the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. This was no longer about his past with Kyle or his family. It was about healing, about showing that love could transcend the bitterness that had once existed between them. For the next few days, Jason worked tirelessly, using his skills in healthcare and his knowledge from his studies to support Kyle's mother. The family had always been proud and self-reliant, but they were now at their lowest point. There was no money left for expensive treatments, no hope in sight. Jason found himself making difficult decisions, navigating a world where love and science intersected in delicate balance. But through it all, he remained calm and steady, his father's lessons echoing in his mind. As the days passed, Kyle's mother slowly improved, though the road to recovery was uncertain. Jason knew that even though he had helped them, the real healing would take time, not just for Kyle's mother, but for Kyle himself and for the fractured relationships that needed mending. This wasn't a quick fix. It was a process, one that required patience, humility, and the willingness to confront the past in order to move forward. The night before he was scheduled to leave, Jason and Kyle sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The air was cooler now, and the familiar sounds of crickets filled the silence between them. It was a moment of quiet reflection, one that Jason never anticipated having with Kyle. "I don't know how to thank you, Jason," Kyle said softly, his voice tinged with guilt. "I know I was an idiot back then. I never understood what you went through, what you've been through. But now, I get it. I just want you to know I'm sorry for all of it, all the things I said. I was just too stupid to see the bigger picture." Jason turned to face him, his expression steady. "You don't need to apologize, Kyle. I'm not here for that. I'm here because people need help, and I'm lucky enough to have the skills to give that help. But the real healing isn't about fixing what's broken on the outside. It's about understanding each other, being kind, and moving forward with empathy. We've both learned something from this, and that's what matters. Kyle looked up at the stars, a quiet understanding passing between them. They weren't the same boys who had once sat at opposite ends of the high school cafeteria. They had both grown, both learned the hard lessons of life, and perhaps, just perhaps, they had begun to understand the true meaning of family. The following day, as Jason said his goodbyes and returned to his university, he reflected on everything that had led to this moment. He had always been a product of his father's teachings, but now he was shaping his own legacy. A legacy not defined by the color of his skin or the prejudices he faced, but by his heart, his courage, and his capacity to forgive and heal. As Jason stepped into his future, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be struggles, but he was no longer afraid of them. He was armed with the knowledge that love, above all else, was the most powerful force of all.